Hi, I'm Sarah Gebauer. I'm a physician and I spend a lot of time with healthcare AI companies that can't figure out why their models aren't getting adopted. They'll show me these beautiful benchmarks, impressive AU rock scores, and papers in top journals. Then they'll tell me about the hospital that turned off their sepsis alerts after just a few weeks, or the radiology group that stopped using their AI because it just added too many clicks, or the ICU that went back to the manual early warning system because the AI just couldn't handle missing data. And we know that 80% of healthcare AI projects fail to scale and never make it past the pilot. And it's almost never the algorithm that failed. It's usually the disconnect between the clinical world and the engineering world. And today I want to talk about bridging that gap, not just building models the clinical world will use, but building systems that the clinical world and clinicians will really use. So why do you want to listen to me? I'm an anesthesiologist, and I've spent the last 20 years in operating rooms where systems have to work reliably under pressure. That experience has shaped how I think about AI. And if something's going to fail, you want to know how and when, and not discover that during a crisis. I also spent several years at RAND evaluating AI models for national security risks. And healthcare and national security have a lot more in common than you might think. They both involve high stakes decisions and complex systems and success metrics that are often moving targets. And these days, I run Validara Health, which works with healthcare AI companies on government and deployment challenges. I also write a Substack on healthcare AI and host a large Slack community where physicians learn about AI and also share their experiences as AI leaders in hospital systems, which means I get to hear about both the wonderful successes of many of these tools and where there are issues. What I've learned is that most deployment problems aren't about the models themselves. Often they're about choices that are made during the development process and in the engineering process that can determine whether clinicians and health systems will actually use what gets built. So I also want to emphasize the human toll of these brilliant engineering innovations not making it into practice. All of you are working very hard on very sophisticated and meaningful software. And I really want to say that patients are harmed when you don't get that software into the place where it actually helps people. So bridging this divide between the clinical world and the engineering world is incredibly crucial, not just to get a product out there and not just for you and your company, but really for the patients that I see every day and that my fellow physicians see. We really want to help these people, but we need your help to do that. And the other thing that we want to that I want to emphasize is why a lot of these healthcare AI tools fail at adoption. I personally, in a normal clinical day, get about 200 alerts in the electronic medical record, and many of them are urgent, and I ignore almost all of them. Um, they talk about lab values that are abnormal but have been stable for years. Every time I sign an order for a patient to go to the recovery room, for example, I get, and I'm not exaggerating, at least 20 drug interaction warnings for combinations that I prescribe every single day for every single patient. And, you know, me ignoring most of them is pretty common. Most studies show that about 80% of clinical alerts get ignored by physicians. And the problem isn't that we're lazy or careless, it's that a lot of these tools just weren't designed around how clinical medicine actually works. They fire off alerts based on statistical thresholds, not clinical context, and they interrupt workflow at times that are convenient for the software, but not so much for the physician. And the real challenge often that I've seen isn't building a model that is really good. It's building a model that tells the clinicians something they need to know when they need to know it in a way that actually works and fits their workflow. And this is much harder than it sounds and requires engaging healthcare experts early in the process. So we see this pattern at scale too. One well-known example is a sepsis prediction model that was studied across 24 hospitals. And during COVID, the model generated 43% more alerts while patient census dropped 35%. And then, not surprisingly, everyone just started ignoring these alerts completely, including the legitimate ones. And the quality of care then went down because of that. Again, this harmed real patients in a real context. And again, the model wasn't wrong. The model was doing what it was supposed to do, but it was detecting statistical patterns associated with a clinical risk or setting that no longer existed. Um, and for these clinical tools, we really want to make sure that they are paying attention to the right things at the right time. And, the reality check is that if it interrupts the clinician's workflow, they're just going to stop using it completely and turn it off. So we want to measure what matters. So what is that? In medicine, we really focus on evidence-based medicine, which has a key component being that does this change clinical decision making? So you want to describe what you do and how you're thinking in a way that will also resonate with clinicians. So you want to describe false negative and false positive costs and patient outcomes, not just in statistical measures. You want to describe how your tool would make the hard days easier, not all of its technical impressive features. Um, and you want to see if people are still using it after a pilot. You want to see how long it takes clinicians to do things after they've started using your product. Does it add time? It's probably not going to last very long if so. And then you want to make sure that if it does clinical decision making or helps with clinical decision making, that it's not being overridden constantly by the clinicians using it. That's also not a good sign. And if so, who's usually right? Maybe it's your tool, and maybe the clinician's wrong. And so, in terms of translating these metrics, um, you know, area under the curve is just not a language clinicians speak or understand. They really want to hear about sensitivity and specificity and number needed to treat. Those are very common clinical metrics. Um, you can change those very easily, though, from things that you think about. They really do translate directly into things clinicians care about. It just has to be in the right language. And then really shifting to understanding that healthcare's main tech problem is usually not the tech, it's the last mile problem and the change management associated with health tech. So, we've been seeing this for the last 20 years, ever since EHRs were introduced, and it's just been an ongoing issue. Clinicians have a lot of fragmented workflow, a lot of alert fatigue, as we talked about, a lot of time pressure, a lot of both moral time pressure to take really good care of their patients. And then a lot of them feel a lot of pressure from their employers to see as many patients as possible also. And because of some of the failures in EHR implementation, a lot of clinicians are skeptical of new tools, and they're worried that this will be a repeat. So this isn't about dumbing down your technology. It's really about directing your technical sophistication towards the way clinicians think and speak, and towards the problems that matter the most to them. So there are 5 engineering decisions that tend to separate successful deployments from failed ones. The first one is always workflow integration. This is something I work on all the time. The most brilliant model in the entire world that has ever been developed for the most important problem, I promise you, will die if it doesn't fit into how the workflow actually gets done. Bias and explainability is a really, really important piece, both for the moral aspects of medicine and also for some of the legal aspects now that hospitals and health systems are dealing with. Production risk systems. Hospitals expect things to work, but they know that sometimes they break, and they really want to know that you have a plan for if your system breaks or has downtime or whatever, that there is some kind of plan for managing that appropriately that will not affect clinical care. Continuous monitoring. This is something that really we are trying to get better at. That is not yet great, but we know that patient populations shift, people move. The COVID example, for example, those the kinds of patients that were coming in were very different than usual. So a lot of the statistics were also different than they usually would have been. Protocols change, sometimes very frequently. Sometimes every 6 months we might have a new way to treat or approach a problem. We need to make sure that any AI models are reflecting that, or else, you know, really as clinicians and physicians, we're on the hook for not following standard of care if those models don't help us do that. Uh, Data formats evolve. That's been, data formats are always a challenge in healthcare, and they're getting better, but they're not uniformly great yet. And then compliance is code. So really, you want to be thinking about some of these regulatory requirements, governance requirements early in your development process, so that you don't have to go back and either add in work or develop different kinds of tests or workflows uh, from the beginning. And often these kind of issues are what determine whether a healthcare system is comfortable implementing your product or not. So workflow integration, like I said, it's usually predictable patterns. So if you are planning to create an entirely new dashboard that clinicians have to log on to separately, that's going to be a pretty hard sell. Um, Nobody likes to have more passwords and logins, and really things that work are things like Fire, for data exchange, CDS hooks, UI components that are embedded into their existing systems. Um, and I don't want to imply that any of this is technically easy, because I know it's not, but it really does help when these kind of systems don't create extra work and mental load for the clinicians. And then also just understanding how interruption driven healthcare is. So it's to the point that a lot of nursing units now have implemented a no interruption time every day, twice a day, usually, when nurses give medications, because it's such a foundational issue. All clinicians get texts, messages, lab alerts, phone calls, in person requests, people pulling them aside, family members coming by all day long. It's If you have young children, that is about the level of interruption that you have, except you're trying to do very high level intellectual work and actually think, and keep people healthy and in a high pressure environment, while you're being interrupted basically as many times as a toddler would interrupt you during the day. So your system really needs to understand this reality, needs to know when to surface the information, in what format, um, when the information should fit into existing cognitive workflows, and explain things in a way that clinicians will automatically be able to slot in without additional mental work. And you just have to understand that clinicians are not just sitting quietly at a desk writing notes or doing work. That is almost never the case. Bias detection and mitigation are really, as I mentioned, important issues. Uh, Healthcare and healthcare data have a lot of historical inequities and current inequities in access and treatment. And the models, of course, reflect that in kind of surprising ways sometimes. So, mitigating bias is a major consideration for most AI governance committees, both because it's the right thing to do for our patients, and also because it's one of the few healthcare AI requirements that has a legal aspect to it in the US for software that's not software as a medical device, software that's SaaS. So you also are going to have expectations around subgroup analysis. You want to give clinicians training on which patients a system should and shouldn't be used on. A model that's only for adults and doesn't have any pediatric training data, for example, you want to tell people you should not use this in kids. Similarly, multiple studies about certain models doing badly at skin cancer detection on certain skin colors. So, more importantly, healthcare systems are really aware of these issues, and they'll ask hard questions about how your model performs with regards to equity. And these may even apply to administrative systems. So there are studies that show significant inequities even for the kind of tools that determine, for example, if patients will get certain social services or support interventions. So how do you handle bias and fairness is one of the most common questions that I see in AI governance questionnaires. You have to have a good answer for it. Technically, you can use subgroup analysis across demographics, fairness metrics like equalized odds, demographic parity. You can validate on diverse external data sets. And then you also want to test on local data if possible. And increasingly, there are virtual sandboxes with the hospital systems to help do this. Some health systems are actually requiring that is done. So with monitoring, you're going to want to show that you're looking for statistical drift, that you can catch changes, that you're tracking clinical outcomes if you can, and if that's part of your tool. And you're monitoring safety events. This is huge, especially if they're related to your system's recommendations or workflow. As I mentioned, tracking alert overrides really helps demonstrate that you are helping in the system and not hindering clinicians from doing their jobs. And for the infrastructure side, we don't really care what tools you use, as long as you can explain why you use them and they make sense for a use case. We really want to see that there are feedback loops that are built that can inform model updates and catch problems before they impact patients and before they cause any problems clinically. So also really important to have an answer to how do you incorporate new guidelines, as I mentioned. You want to have a continuous feedback loop somehow with the clinical experts to know that you are doing the best thing that science knows about at that time for the patients that you're impacting. So you want to, as I mentioned, make sure that you can answer, if your data feed goes down, what do you do? If your system goes out, how are we supposed to handle our workflow in that situation? This is normal healthcare IT stuff. This is not necessarily specific to AI. And Epic actually, I always laugh when I am on call in the middle of the night from 2 to 3 a.m. During the daylight savings change and have 2 periods of 2 a.m. to 3 a.m., which is really not anything anyone has ever wanted. But we have to chart on paper during that time. So it's Epic's way to remind everyone how to chart on paper, at least everyone who is awake during that wonderful hour. So have some kind of plan for that, incomplete inputs, and then figuring that out from the start and not having to go back and figure out those plans are really going to help you to develop a strong system and a strong pitch in terms of we have thought through all these issues very, very well, and you are not going to have issues with us. And then you have a full life cycle of clinical AI readiness. So you really want to go from, design, validation, deployment, post-marketing, and become friends with your risk management team. These are people that are going to help you make sure that you're not running afoul of any of the very frequently changing local laws and regulations. This is something that Pacific AI does particularly well in terms of making sure that they have the rules and regulations available and updated in a way that others can use, because it's an overwhelming process to try to keep track of those. So during the design process, you want to make sure that how you think it's going to be used is actually how people will use it, that you are validating that and talking to clinical experts, making sure that it's explainable to them, that they understand where that information is coming from. That'll be a big question of theirs also. During deployment, you're going to have to get a governance review before you before you're actually deployed in most cases. Some places might let you do a pilot before you go through that system, and some won't. And then, of course, post-market or post-deployment, you are going to have to do some kind of continuous monitoring, and you're going to want to choose your metrics carefully and make sure that they're meaningful to the people that will be evaluating them. So, um, just want to touch on some of the software as a medical device and regulatory frameworks. So these are all in the process of being developed. There are different systems and stakeholders and different ways to approach these, but I want to talk about software as a medical device versus SaaS first. Much of the software that's being implemented right now is being considered as SaaS. It, I think there will be an increasing number of products that will want to be FDA approved as software as a medical device, in part because you can get paid by insurers if you are, and then also because they want to be able to do more sophisticated things with their software. So important to understand that the category is based on intended use, not on a subjective risk level, although there is a risk level assessment as part of that review. Um, if you are diagnosing conditions directly and recommending specific treatments, or powering a medical device, then you will almost assuredly be considered software as a medical device. You can actually get in touch with the FDA and email them if you need to ask questions about whether your product falls under SaaS or software as a medical device. And I would recommend doing that if you have any questions, because you don't want to mistakenly assume that you're SaaS and then have to go back and do all this paperwork at a later date. It'll really slow you down. So these are the engineering requirements for software as a medical device. Pretty standard stuff in terms of what you probably do. You know, you're gonna have a data set and endpoints. You are going to want to have clinical validation studies. ISO 14971, software verification reports, and post-market monitoring abilities. And then this in Europe, the CE marking is relatively it can be more stringent, but it also requires clinical evaluation reports, comprehensive risk management, usability testing, and post-market surveillance plans. So similar to what the FDA requires. ISO, everyone's probably fairly familiar with. These are some common ones that we see in healthcare. The EU AI Act is really one of the newer pieces of regulatory outline and framework that people are trying to get their heads around right now, I think all over the world. Much of healthcare AI qualifies as high risk, even things that in the US we would consider as SaaS. I know many people saw that in the UK, for example, many of the ambient scribes are now considered as being covered under their one of their levels of basically similar to FDA approval as software as a medical device. And the EU has taken a pretty conservative approach to AI generally, and interestingly, they require explainability methods, transparent AI decision processes, which sometimes can be hard with healthcare, and evidence of equitable performance. And then the penalty for not being able to demonstrate that you followed safety processes can be up to 6% of global revenue, which is pretty staggering to most people. So this is a big deal. A lot of the regulations don't actually go into effect until 2026 to 2027. And people are still kind of figuring out exactly what is needed to comply with this. So I would expect more details in the coming months to years. And this slide really just shows, what kinds of levels of regulatory adherence you need to focus on. that you could see that most of them you do have to do. Uh, if you're doing diagnostic AI, treatment decision support, and there's some nuance here in terms of exactly which kinds of treatments and how much support you're giving, uh, and then workflow optimization. A lot of times you don't have to get qualify go through the FDA process for that, but the it does apply if workflow flow changes could affect patient safety or clinical decisions. So that's just something to keep in mind as you determine what your level of liability and regulatory need is. All right, so now we have all these requirements. What are you supposed to do here? So, really, before you build anything, you want to make architecture decisions around fire integration, monitoring frameworks, bias detection tools. Uh, Choose your tech stack with compliance outputs in mind. Really think about the stuff from the beginning so that you don't have to go back. It's, I promise, a much easier path. Um, and then you want to, um, you know, shadow clinical workflows extensively. Don't just observe them and don't just ask them questions. Often they will forget a lot of steps and or do things automatically and forget what they've done. You want to understand the cognitive load and the interruption patterns and the workarounds that they use, because almost everywhere will be using some kind of workaround for tech products that they have right now. And then you want to implement explainability features and develop comprehensive monitoring dashboards. You want to build bias detection into your validation pipeline also, and generate initial compliance documentation. The key deliverables that really matter, the bias testing across patient populations. You want to show drift monitoring, how you're going to handle risk and failures, and actual impact. So, you really want to get that pilot evidence that shows that people are happy with your product, it makes their lives easier, and it benefits patients. So when you present to hospital committees, these are the kinds of questions that you're going to get. So very similar to what the regulatory questions are. And the governance committees are kind of like FDA, SAMD light in a lot of ways. You have to show that the product's safe, that it's not going to harm patients, and that it is not biased, and that you have plans for all these things. So regardless of whether you think that you're SaaS or you're SAMD, you're going to need answers to these questions no matter what. It's going to be a more extensive and thorough process if you do need to go through SAMD. But either way, a lot of these pieces are going to be the same backbone. And hospitals are really becoming more sophisticated with their expectations for responses. So even a year ago, you could kind of get by with saying, oh, we take care of that. We have a system for it. That is not going to cut it anymore. Hospitals really want to hear, that what your actual plan is, and are getting sophisticated enough to understand what that is from a technical standpoint. So you also need to really communicate well with your sales team and your product management team to make sure that you have those kind of data and details in a format that the clinical teams and the governance teams can readily understand and digest. So the most efficient way I've seen people do this is to really just automate the compliance outputs from your development pipeline. Just start it from the beginning, and your experiment logs can really become ISO risk tables in a way. Your validation notebooks can generate clinical evidence, monitoring dashboards. You can make into post-market surveillance reports. And if you do this well, it'll really give you an advantage in the marketplace, because a lot of people don't think about these things until it's really late in the game and have to go back and spend a lot of time and money to get this kind of data and information. If your team is cohesive and you understand what sales teams are hearing in terms of what their customers are wanting, and they understand the kinds of testing that you're doing, usually people are doing amazing safety testing in healthcare. I mean, I get to talk to lots of companies, and am always impressed by how much safety testing they do. Unfortunately, a lot of that is not communicated to the sales and marketing teams, and so it doesn't get to the customers in a way that would really help give the company a competitive advantage if they were able to know that that data existed and translate it into information that the users could really get excited about. So uh, these are some questions that are very common. I see these all the time. How did you test bias? Uh, can the clinicians understand the outputs? How do they know it's correct? And the next thing you want to do um, after you go through these steps that we talked about, so shadowing, running some initial testing, and then monitoring, is really think about how important your work is. And I want to really leave you with this thought that uh, we in clinical medicine, we're doing our best for our patients every day. And we cannot move forward with medicine without you. Clinicians depend on the talent and ingenuity of engineers to bring us new products and create solutions that we can use to directly help our patients. And this is not an exaggeration. We really need you to move medicine forward to the next stage. So I want to thank you for your service to medicine and to the patients that I treat and all of my fellow physicians treat in helping to advance the field, because we need to work together to do that and to really make a difference in patients' lives. So thank you. Thank you for helping us care for our patients and for the time, energy, and expertise that you bring to the field.